what did the habitat look like? I know you mentioned when Al Brothers drove from Texas to South Carolina and what he noticed and what he commented. What was in not only what did it look like, but more so like where did it rank in as far as the scale of quality habitat? Was it? Can you talk a little bit about that at that time?
Yeah. The cattle industry was very strong back in those days, from the 40s, 50s, into the 60s, and even into the 70s. So if you ride through this part of the world, if you would ride through back then, there was a lot of pasture land, a lot. Those larger acreages got bought up by timber companies. Westvaco was one of the major ones here, Georgia Pacific, another, Bowater, another, and on and on and on. They were buying up vast acreages of properties that were open in a lot of cases, a lot of pasture land, and converting those to timberland. When you do that on a small scale, you take a pasture that's been growing only cattle, and you plant pine trees there. Those first few years, you've got, in the absence of cattle, you've got a lot of forbs coming up that are feeding deer, and that's really good for deer for 4 or 5 years. And then as the pines get older, you get crown closure and you get shade. Shade is your number one enemy. And all of a sudden that food supply diminishes. But with good timber management, you're going to be thinning in a few years. Then you're going to do a clear cut and have that much more food all over again. Another thing that was happening back in those days is the Conservation Reserve Program came about. And these landowners were able to plant trees in areas that were maybe not so productive for agricultural crops. So there was a percentage there. If you were participating in that program, you could plant areas in timber, in pines in particular, and yet you had to keep some openings for wildlife, and that worked fine for a while too. But all that matures, and you get shade again. So in the equation of all this change in land use, shade was a continual problem, and it is today. We talk about it in our Deer Steward 2 course and show how you can, through good timber management, create more sunlight to the ground floor and get forest floor and get a lot of legumes responding to that kind of thing. And old field management is good for that too. But we've had these problems all along the way, these little stumbling blocks. I can't overemphasize the importance of shade as being a controlling factor. And then in the late 70s, early 80s, we had an imposter move in, the coyote. And I made a grave mistake back in those early days. I got my hands on a few and went through them, did a necropsy on them to see just what was going on inside. Being a canid, I thought, well, if you don't treat a dog for heartworms, you're going to have a relatively short relationship at the time my dog starts whining. So I told people then, I said, look, all these problems that dogs are facing, you got parvo and distemper and mange and heartworms, we can control that with regular visits to the veterinarian. The coyotes can't. So you don't have to worry about them. I really underestimated their ability to procreate. And look, almost 100% of the coyotes that I looked at then, and even now, have heartworms. So you don't have too many old timers in the coyote community. But look, if a female coyote lives to the age of 4 and then dies of heartworms, she's had 3 years of producing little ones.
That's right.
So, yeah, that was a problem that I had in the early days, not recognizing the potential impact of coyotes.
Sure.
And that's something that we're just going to have to live with in the future. We were talking about the future of deer hunting. They're a member of the management team,
Right.
like it or not, and we just have to work around it. We can do a lot to work on habitat, to have good fawning cover in almost this time of the year, a little bit later. But nevertheless, we can trap. But what is that doing to the coyote population? Do you bring in others by creating a vacuum?
That's right. It's predator that's here on the landscape.
Yeah. And
I have some more follow-up habitat questions, but we got to circle back to this movement because I don't. My earliest memories hunting would be probably in about that time, late 80s,
Mhm.
that I can vividly remember. I was out in the woods with my family, but I don't know much about what was going on at the time. Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned the education side, and of course more of the education came with down the road with QDMA and your signpost newsletter, but what about that was it the fourth deer study group? I mean, what about when you were doing those talks, yourself, Al Brothers,
Mhm.
was there anybody else in the trenches with you, and what was that like? Because you're talking about a time when it wasn't like these hunters were just, for the past couple of years, they weren't shooting does. They grew up not shooting does.
That's right.
And the people that mentored them as hunters weren't shooting does. It was multi-generational. So you can talk about that.
Mhm.
I mean, was that not an uphill battle?
To say the least. And I think the thing that maybe brought us to the dance quicker than others is because of our liberal seasons and liberal limits, and the hunters are able to hunt themselves into a corner quicker here, and therefore had a need to come out of that hole somehow or another. Well, here's how deeply tradition ran back in those days. I moved to this county in 85 after I got out of the deer pen. We finished our study there, and I came here in 85. I spent my whole summer working with new entries to our antlerless deer quota program. We were adding 50 or 60 or even 100 a year, and I had to make a site visit to every single property, get some idea of the harvest history.
Really? That's a. I'm not sorry to interrupt. That's a lot of work. I know you know that, but that's a lot of work.
I did that, and it was before the day of the cell phone, and I had to spend my time one night at home getting all my appointments lined up the next day so I had to get my maps out and try to line the people up so I can be with this fella for 2 hours and try to get his neighbor down the road for the next 2 hours and do 4 or 5 or 6 a day. And yeah, it was a back-breaking thing to get in touch with these, rather than just filling out the paperwork and saying, all right, we're going to give you this many tags. We tried to have a reason behind that. And we looked at their harvest history, we looked at the crop damage in the area, we looked at road kills. All of that was considered, and their objectives. You know, what are your objectives? I mean, how many deer can you kill? How many deer do you want to kill? How many deer do you need to kill? Did all of that. Well, after I spent my first summer doing that, I had to go meet with our local senator. And see if he approved my doe quota.
Did he?
Well, no. So I met with him, and I'll tell you this, just prior to my meeting with him, I mentioned that I moved here in 85, in July of 85. there were petitions going around in this county to make it illegal to shoot does. And there were 2 local veterinarians that were behind that movement. Well, who's going to listen to a wet behind the ears biologist when the people that have been here for years and years and years have been their local veterinarians for a lifetime? If they say you shouldn't shoot does, that's the gospel. And my predecessor here was a classmate of mine at Georgia, undergraduate and graduate, and he decided he would have a private consulting business. So when he told me he was leaving this job, I was in the front of the line with my hand up. I like this job in this part of the world. So I came straight here from the deer pen. But then I had to go see the senator, and he gave me a lesson on the way things were. He said, "You're aware of this petition?" I said, "Yes, sir, I know about the petition and I know who's behind it." And yep, he said, "And your predecessor was really aggressive on these doe stamps." I said, "Yes, sir, I know that." He said, "You know, he most got run out of town on a rail, tarred and feathered." I said, "Yes, sir, I know all of that." He said, "Well, you look like a very astute young man. I guess you've done your homework." And I said, "Yes, sir, I've been working on this all summer long." He said, "Well, did you reduce last year's quota by 25%? I said, "No, sir, I didn't." 50%? "No, sir." "You didn't reduce it 75%, did you?" And I said, "No, sir, I doubled it from last year." And he grabbed the back of his desk and he said, "Great gosh, boy, they're going to run us both out of town on a rail, tarred and feathered." And I said, "Senator, here's how I see the situation. You're an elected official. You have to respond to your constituents. I have to respond to mine. My job is biologically oriented. Yours is politically oriented. I'll make a promise to you." I'm thinking back how Al Brothers might do this. "I'll make a promise to you. I will go to these major movers that are behind this petition." And I named about 5 or 6 of them. He said, "Oh, you have done your homework." And I said, "I know exactly who they are. But I'll go to them personally, not with a phone call. I will face to face with them, explain what I'm doing. And in the meantime, I've got a radio program that I do every Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. And they can chime in on that. I'm meeting with every group in this town and in this county. Church groups, school groups, civic clubs, garden clubs. If I can't get to the men directly, I get to their wives and let them indirectly influence their husbands as to what we're trying to do with this new kind of deer management." And I said, I'll do all of that. And if you have any problems, all you've got to do is call me and I will go see that particular person. I never got a call from him. Education worked. We became the first county to harvest more does than bucks. We became the first district in the state of 7 counties in District 5 to kill more does than bucks.
Wow.
And it was up and running by that time.
So just so I understand, during that time, South Carolina, what was legal or not legal to shoot? So it was it. I mean, like by law, what were the rules?
Yeah, we had some doe days back in those early years, but like you said, tradition ran so deeply, people just would not shoot them, and if they did, they wouldn't shoot enough to make a difference. They were shooting them for meat to make sure they had some venison for the table at Thanksgiving or around Christmas time, but
it wasn't a strategic goal.
It was not done for a biological reason, and because there was no education leading up to that. You've got to take the people through that course again from the educational process for awareness to enlightenment to respect, then you're somewhere. Then you can make a difference.
What do you think was more difficult? Because a lot of what you were dealing with at the time was new for a lot of hunters, to say the least.
Yeah.
What was more challenging, educational on the herd health, or was it the habitat, or was it maintaining, all the above once you get it rolling? What was?
I think herd health was the thing that we could most easily manage because we had and quantify. We had people that were really participating, keeping good records on weights and antler development,
Yes,
and they could see changes in body weights. They could see, of course, the bucks were getting older. They saw bigger antlers, but they later saw better antlers by age class when the deer herd was in better balance with the habitat conditions. So it wasn't until later that we really got a stronghold on managing the habitat as well. And it probably started with timber management. We had a symposium at Clemson University back in the 80s, and it was integrating forestry and wildlife. And that was our first attempt professionally and officially to bring people together to understand that the disciplines of forestry and wildlife management go hand in hand. And then started talking about food plots. That didn't come about until probably in the late 80s or 90s.
Right, yes, sir.
I was living on a plantation from 85 for the next 10 years, and so I had a 3,000 acre lab to work in, not only with deer management, but to do something with habitat, because it had been a cattle operation up until the time I got there. It had vast acreages of pastures, so we planted pine trees with sort of an artistic flair about it. We got an acetate overlay and connected all the little hardwood woodlots with planted pines, but we did it sort of in a serpentine fashion. We left openings, we left corridors in, thinking down the road, we're gonna have a blank spot here, we need to plant in something down the road. And so I was doing all of that on this test area, and the owners were very, very nice to work with, and they saw the changes coming about and were able to measure that in antlers. And I was reading an agricultural journal about this plant that cattle farmers were using down in Florida, and they were complaining that the deer were just wiping it out. And it turns out it was American joint vetch, or Ashenominy. So I got a bag of it, and my gosh, I mean, at the time it was around $2 a pound, which was a lot. But I got a bag of it and planted it, and my gosh, I couldn't believe how the deer came to it. I mean, it was really high protein, whatever. But I had some problems with weed competition. Didn't know anything about herbicides back in those days.
Who did?
So when something was outgrowing my desired plant, and it was usually coffee weed or sesbania or some of the other plants that were outgrowing the plant that I had put there, the Ashenominy or joint vetch, I thought, well, here comes shade again.
That's right.
One of my number one enemies. So I just raised the bush hog over the top of my Ashenominy and obliterated my shade.
There you go.
But that was the progenitor of any kind of herbicide. We can do that better now with things we can spray. But
that's right. Not to name any names, but was there any one sector in the hunting world or biologists or state agencies that just didn't think QDM was going to work in the South. You know, Al Brothers wrote a great book, Texas. They're doing it in Texas. Texas is different, and they are different, and they like to be different. But was there anyone just saying, not to manage through does, but just in general, QDM is just not going to work here? Was there anybody like that?
Of course, and it was in-house. It was right here in South Carolina. At some of our biologist meetings, those of us that were professing this novel approach, they said, you're catering to the elite. You're catering to the large landowners and to the moneyed faction of hunters, and you're trying to produce trophy bucks, and it's just not going to work. And I said, well, first of all, trophy bucks are not our goal. We're trying to produce older bucks, and some of those become trophies, that's for sure. But it's a lot more than the buck segment. The quality management is talking about quality does and fawns, quality habitat, quality hunters, quality hunting experiences, and you're home free when you get to that point. If you keep the hunters happy and the deer healthy, you can't have a better winning situation. But I did have some fellow biologists who gave us a hard time initially in the house. So you can imagine what it was like in some other states. And there were some biologists in other states that were vehemently opposed to quality deer management. Now, one of them was a northern state. I will not mention the state, but that biologist hated this quality deer management movement because he was a modeler, and the key item in his modeling were all of the measurements of 1.5-year-old bucks, antler development, average weight from year to year to year. We robbed him of those figures because we were trying to protect most of the 1.5-year-old bucks. I mean, he couldn't model after that point. But so we really had a hard time with him. I mean, he and I had some very heated discussions.
Really?
Yeah, heated.
And I don't want to get in that world name, but I mean, the reason why I asked that question, for that reason, because I feel like, you know, you were young biologist, you're spearheading this movement.
Yeah.
There had to have been some people that maybe were older than you that just want to pump the brakes, and they wanted to find a flaw, find something.
That's right.
Why it wouldn't work.
Yeah. Well, there was a lot of that going on back in those early days, but thank goodness the adaptable whitetail was probably one of the best items to work with, because if you treat them right, let them get a little bit older before you harvest them, the bucks in particular, you feed them well, which is good habitat management, they're going to show you in antler development and in the quality of your hunting experiences. You're going to see a lot more rubs and scrapes, and you can see bucks chasing does, and you're going to start finding shed antlers. The rats and squirrels are not going to eat them all. And then you're going to start using trail cameras down the road, and that's going to show you even more that's out there. And it's been pretty exciting along the way, but it was a bumpy start.
I'm sure.
We're up and running now. Let me give you some figures, sort of some barometers for what's happened. We've been doing, the QDMA and now the NDA, for about 16 or 17 years now, I think, been doing an annual sort of the State of the Union deer report. When we started in 89, I think it was 89, looking at the percent of 1.5-year-old bucks in the harvest across the nation, number one, we didn't have total cooperation from all the states. We had a lot of blanks because they weren't with us yet.
Sure.
Now they are. They are. There are no blank spots now. Everybody's working with us. But from what we could tell in those early days, almost 70% of the annual buck harvest was made up by 1.5-year-old bucks. Just recently, that percent is down to 26.
That's just amazing.
And that's across the nation. That's not the tens of thousands of members in the NDA. That's 11 million deer hunters across the nation that are responding to the educational efforts that have come out through podcasts and magazines and seminars and talks, all of that, radio programs, TV programs, and all that. What that means, though, is that if you're taking a little over a quarter of your bucks at 1.5 years, what's happening to the others? Well, we broke a record last year on the percent 3.5 and older bucks, and it was 40-something percent.
That's amazing. I mean, that's a staggering number.
Yeah.
If you really think about it.
Another staggering number, going back to those early years of trying to break tradition and get hunters to harvest enough antlerless deer to manage their deer herds properly. In 1999, across the nation, we harvested more antlerless deer than antler deer. First time ever on record. And it hadn't been that way every year since.
Right.
A lot of places do still have fairly close sex ratios in their harvest. But now we've got the coyote that's on the management team now. Not a good player, very efficient, but the coyote is taking their share. And in some cases, when back in our early days, the recruitment rate, which was the number of fawns making it into the fall, there was 1.2. So there were a lot of does that were having twins and successfully bringing them into the fall population, which is the definition of recruitment. They don't have to be just born. They've got to be born, make it through the summer, and then be brought into the fall population to fulfill that definition of recruitment. In some places now, because of coyotes and hogs are competing as well for food as well as doing some predation. It's down to 0.2 or 0.3. So
yeah,
that's something that we're going to have to deal with. And we've got some disease problems. We've always had disease problems, especially in this area with hemorrhagic disease, EHD, which is epizootic hemorrhagic disease. It's a viral disease. It's always here. It's transmitted by the little midge, no-see-em, and our deer have learned to deal with that. They've built antibodies. They're not as affected as deer that are new to the disease, especially in the Northeast and the Midwest. There are places in recent history that have lost maybe 50% of their deer herd just in 1-2 month period to hemorrhagic disease. Down here, we're in the single digits, 5% maybe, and we can live with that. But it's just not as much of a problem here. And now we've got chronic wasting disease. What's the future hold there? It's probably in nearly 30 states now, several Canadian provinces, several foreign countries, Korea, for example. So we, as stewards of this really nice animal, this noble whitetail, have always had problems to deal with.
That's right.
And we've always been very successful at solving or at least ameliorating those problems. And we forever have new problems coming on board. The coyote was a new one for us. CWD is a new one. What does the future hold? I just spent some time with Al Brothers a few months ago. with Dr. Craig Harper and Matt Knox, who just retired as a deer project leader from Virginia. Al's main concern now is that land fragmentation is going to be the next major problem to deal with. And then you and I were talking this morning about the growth of savanna. Got nowhere to grow but westward. and it's sort of like deer populations following water courses, river corridors. Land development is following interstates.
That's right.
And I-16 heading out of Savannah and going up toward Macon is a prime area for development. So a lot of these areas that look like beautiful deer habitat and are good deer habitat are going to be backyards before you know it.